So, before we begin our discussion of Chapter 4, Renaissance Science and Philosophy, let's review what we finished up last session. Chapter 3, Rome in the Middle Ages. So, let's look at some of the key ideas during that last session. So, now we've left the period of the ancient Greeks. Okay, we have had these big questions about the universe, the cosmos, being asked about by these philosophers, and now we have the Roman Empire in town. The Romans invade Greek territories, and then all of a sudden, the concerns of the Greek people begin to change. They're not really interested anymore in answering some of these big questions about the universe and how things operate. So their philosophical perspective changes. So here are some of the ideas that represent these different philosophical views. We have skepticism, the idea that you don't believe in anything, that all these ideas that are opposing each other could be equally wrong. Therefore, you save a lot of headache by just not buying into any particular thing to become a true skeptic. Then we have the cynics or cynicism. Here, their approach, their philosophical agenda was trying to get back to nature, to live a simpler life, a life that was not confused with ideas which were not necessary for living. So with this back to nature view of living, they saw this as a way to improve their situation. So here they used animals as a guide about how it is that you could have a simple life. Then we have the Epicureanism. Okay, with Epicureanism, the idea here is that they offer was that there is no afterlife, so don't worry about it. That you need to focus on the life you have now, having a good life that you are existing in at this moment. So you need to find a way to exist and not worry about the afterlife. And then we have the Stoics or Stoicism. This was the idea that seemed to sort of catch on during this period, the Stoics. Here, the idea of Stoicism was for you to accept your fate. That whatever cards you were dealt in life, these are the cards that you have. You play those cards. You are either a worker slave, you are a soldier, or you are a philosopher king. Whatever is your fate in life, that is it. And you simply should accept it. You should be stoic about it. Then we have the idea of Neoplatonism. Okay, Neoplatonism is the idea of having some sort of notion of a more spiritual type of nature. So they introduced the ideas of God and some sort of mystical force as well. This sort of opened the door for additional discussions about the spirit. And then we saw an emphasis on the spirit. We discussed briefly the ideas of Jesus when it comes to the knowledge of good and evil, about St. Paul, where he noted that Jesus is the Messiah. And he said there should be an emphasis on faith over that of reason. So faith over that of reason or science or rationality. Then we talked about the Dark Age. Here, the Dark Age represents a sort of shift. All right, so we saw the Romans invade after the period of the ancient Greeks. They invade, the philosophical atmosphere changes, so to speak, and then we have this Dark Age. Now, obviously, there was some looting and destruction of material going on during that invasion, but the Dark Age represents where a great deal of knowledge is going to be lost. So we have the Greek knowledge as well as some Roman knowledge as well being lost during this time of great disruption. And during this thing we call the Dark Age, there was really no scientific progression. Science was sort of at a standstill. But what we did see is a growth of superstitions, mysticism, anti-intellectualism, and the great power of the church being rising up. So we saw the establishment of a much, much more powerful church in their beliefs during this period of the Dark Ages where science was not really taking root and not being progressed. So later we start to see the Crusades, where the Europeans start to return to certain areas of the world, to go to the Muslim areas of the world, the Arab areas of the world, and they sort of start to begin to rediscover the works that were lost during these dark ages. It should be noted that that's the European sort of rediscovering those lost works, but in the Arab and Muslim world, they were already there. The Islamic and Jewish influences were strong. They never lost those works that we're rediscovering from the European perspective. Then we see the establishment of scholasticism, the idea of combining the ideas of Aristotle, who is deemed to be more acceptable by way of the ancient Greeks when the church and people like Thomas Aquinas look back to see at these works. And so they combine the Aristotle ideas and views of science with a traditional Christian view. And this scholasticism then became a more powerful entity so that it sort of set the stage for what would happen next. And then later we also wound up talking about Occam's razor, which is basically just a communication of the idea that usually when you have numerous explanations for something having occurred, you want to look for the simplest explanation. That's usually going to be the best. The most parsimonious one is usually the better one to go with when it comes to trying to figure out what is truly going on. So those were some of the key ideas from our last session that we covered. So now let's begin our conversation on Renaissance science and philosophy. So after reading and discussing and reviewing the videos, we should have a familiarity with the major themes of the Renaissance humanism, be acquainted with the views and works of humanists of the Renaissance, be aware of the events that contributed to the rise of humanism that stressed objective study of nature and thus weakening the church authority. Be familiar with Ptolemy's view of the universe and the challenges of those views by Copernicus, Bruno, and Kepler. Be familiar with the many contributions of science of Galileo. Be acquainted with Isaac Newton's contributions and their impact on science in general, and understand the impact that Francis Bacon's radical empiricism had on the practice of science. And finally, be familiar with the numerous ideas and observations of René Descartes, who we've already talked about several times already, and the impact on these on psychology. Okay, first, let's look at church's authority. The church's authority declined due to a variety of things. First, there was Aquinas' acceptance of reason and examination of nature as a ways of knowing God. So again, remember we talked about previously, there was a notion that we can learn about God through scripture of the holy works, and we can learn by reason, by studying God's creation of nature. And what Aquinas did, he didn't really understand at the time, he sort of put the two on sort of equal footing, and the scientists chose to say, okay, we can study science without relation to theology or spirit or faith, because these two are equally capable of having us to know God. So that was a key idea that they used. So the humanist philosophy was sort of born out of those ideas, and they wanted to get back to the ideas of open inquiry that we saw with the Greeks, the idea of questioning and things of that nature. So one of the things that also happened that sort of challenged the church authority, we had exploration around the world going on. And so you had the likes of individuals like Marco Polo exploring Central Asia and China, and they started to notice there were people that did not look like them. The world was not what they thought it was. The world had different people, different types of people in existence. These people were non-white people, for example. So we saw also the discovery of the New World by Columbus, again, with new peoples being discovered. And Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe. All of these opened up the possibilities of understanding that there were new things out there that were not fully being explained by the church at the time. So the invention of movable type by Gutenberg was also a major thing. Here, this sort of helped to create the idea of scholarship. So remember, at this time, before the printing press was around, what people who were very smart did, people who had the ability to read and write, the literate and very elite members of society, they would have to waste a lot of their time, waste in quotes here, a lot of their time was taken up by them copying documents, just copying documents in order to spread various knowledge and words around. But now, because of the printing press, it freed those individuals up to be able to do other work, to be able to come up with new, more beautiful ideas about the world and ask questions themselves, which was a major idea and a major advancement to potentially the ideas of science and understanding how we answer questions. So all of this began a slow unraveling of the church's authority. So let's look at Renaissance humanism. Here we see a tendency to return to a more open-minded inquiry of the early Greek philosophy that we talked about. Remember, we mentioned Thales, about question him, go after his ideas, oppose them, those types of things. They moved from a more God-centered interest to more human-centered interest, the idea of humanism, emphasizing the human aspect of it. Humans had reliable sensory systems, reasoning powers, and the ability to enjoy. And these abilities were God-given, so let's use them. So Renaissance humanism denotes a strong interest in the importance of human beings. So there are four major themes characterized by this Renaissance humanism. We have individualism, the concern for human potential and achievement. The individual has the power to make a positive effect in the world. We also then had personal religion, was the desire for a less formal, ritualistic religion. The emphasis on religion experienced personally rather than imposed upon people by the church. And again, obviously, a church is an institution as well, not just a place of worship, but also an institution made of people. So again, people and organizations and entities like to maintain their power, and that's a key idea as well. So obviously you can see where the church as an institution would have some problems with this, the idea of promoting the notion of a personal religion as opposed to a more formal, organized church institution based one. So we can start to see again some of the themes of this Renaissance humanism that would be problematic to the church in the long run. There was also an intense interest in the works of the early Greek Roman poets, philosophers, and politicians. So here we're trying to skip back past the stuff that went on in the Middle Ages to get back to the time of the ancient Greeks in the earlier days. So there's a desire to read and study the original writings, not the interpretations, but the original works of some of the great authors and philosophers. So we had people who founded the Platonic Academy in Florence to promote Plato's works, and some of which were yet to be discovered. So the idea here is that we looked at this major focus of humanism, of the individualism, the idea of personal religion, looking at the old works done by the old masters, and then we have this Aristotelianism, the idea here that all the works of Aristotle wasn't all great and all that. So with this anti-Aristotelianism movement, they wanted to stop the church's practice of strict adherence to the Aristotle views of science and philosophy alongside that of the Bible. Remember, what they did is they sort of combined the two. Aristotle's views of science and church tradition and dogma became one thing. And when they did that, they made it difficult for anyone to be able to question the ideas of Aristotle directly. So Aristotle's philosophy and Christian theology had created a complex set of rules, regulations, and beliefs that required blind acceptance in order to be a Christian. Okay, so the works of Renaissance humanists. We have Patriarch. He endorsed freeing the human spirit from the medieval traditions, principally that of scholasticism. He focused on God-given human potential. He paved the way for Renaissance art and literature and challenged religious and philosophical authority in paving the way for modern science as well. We have Pico. He proposed that humans have unique capacity for change. We can choose to accept any lifestyle and viewpoint. He argued that all philosophical views were ultimately in agreement and all should be studied and assimilated into the Christian worldview. In essence, he sought peace among philosophical and religious views. And we've seen this idea pop up a time or two already, where we have this idea of trying to reconciliate these ideas which are seem to be opposed to one each other and trying to find some way that they can coexist more peacefully. So then we have Erasmus. He opposed the fanatic belief in anything. So the idea of fanaticism, again, this is the idea of saying things that are just too extreme, they just should be avoided at all costs. They just become more difficult for you to maintain any capability of being open-minded if you really think about it. So he was opposed to fanatic belief in anything. It was generally critical of excesses of all kinds, both within the Catholic Church and the Protestant religion. He wrote The Praise of Folly, in which he attacked the church, philosophers, nobility, and superstitions, and his criticisms may have led to Martin Luther's action. Here, Martin Luther, again, was sort of a rebel, busting out against the church. And so some of these ideas may have spurred him to make his actual changes that did occur with his efforts. So Martin Luther insisted on an intensely personal religion. Okay, again, sort of an anti-institutional religion, insisted on an intensely personal religion. Each person is answerable only to God. Okay, so here, what they're suggesting is you are answerable to God, not to someone else, some other representative, but to God. He de-emphasized the ritual and church hierarchy. And again, the church as an institution would obviously have some problems with this. He initiated the Reformation in 1517 by nailing the 95 theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. He had very progressive ideas about many things, about sex and about marriage. He was anti-celibacy for nuns and priests, for example. So these ideas were, in many regards, very radical, sort of suggesting to people that they need to be thinking for themselves. They need to have more of a human-centric idea about things as they practice sort of a personal type and style of religion. So he stated that humans do not have free will. Instead, they are servants to the will of God. God is the only one who knows why evil exists. Okay, so sort of a deterministic view here, and we can only know certain things. And it led to Protestantism, which denied the authority of the Pope and insisted that each person had the right to interpret the Bible for himself or herself. So here we start to see a large chasm and split between the more official Catholic Church led by the Pope and then a more splinter group with a different type of perspective sort of splintering off from the main body. So early Protestantism was grim, austere, and unforgiving. It also insisted on accepting the existence of God on faith alone. Trying to understand him through reason was foolish. They said, no, there's no double road to learning about God. There is only one way, and that was through faith alone, period. So, then, additional to this, we have Michel de Montaigne. He proposed an extreme form of skepticism. Here, what he proposes is that that he blamed human rationality for most human problems. So this thinking about things, the way we reason, the way we logic. He rejected science as a means of attaining reliable knowledge because scientific truth is always in constant flux. What we believe one day may change the next day with additional information. So with all of this flux, he says, well, geez, using this reason and this rationality really isn't going to help us to find this truth, okay, because it's always in flux. So he believed also that, he's a Mac Daddy skeptic here, that even our sensations, what we sense with our own sensory systems, are illusory, okay, sort of an illusion. He did not share the optimism expressed by earlier Renaissance humanists. His extreme skepticism would influence others like Francis Bacon as well as Rene Descartes to develop their philosophical systems to try to be impervious to Montaigne's doubts about our sensations and being able to find some sort of truth. So those individuals were trying to work within Montaigne's system of doubts to try to come up with systems that could sort of beat it. All right, so looking at the works of Renaissance humanists. So we have, for example, Leonardo da Vinci in art and physiology, Machiavelli looking at politics, Jean Louis Vives looking at pedagogy or education. The Renaissance also was seen as a very paradoxical time, meaning that it was sort of like some great stuff going on in one area, but some really horrible stuff going on in another area. And we could probably say that we see some similarities, even probably within the time that we live in now at this very moment. So here with the Renaissance, this paradoxical time, we have great human achievements, interested human potential, unparalleled creativity, but we also had persecution, superstition, fear, wars, and famine. So we have the possibility of this great growth in science, but also at the same time, we were burning people as witches. And we were vilifying scientists for the ideas they came up with that happened to go against the church. So these were some of the major issues going on at the same time when it comes to this great notion and the spirit of Renaissance humanism too. So great growth, but also a lot of backward ideas still being promoted and acted on. Then we have Ptolemy. And Ptolemy we've discussed before with his geocentric system of the universe, with the idea that the earth is the center of all heavenly bodies. Remember, the notion here was very much supported by the church system, and that we are special, we are human, we're special under God. Therefore, of course, we are in the center of everything. We're on the earth's in the center, and everything revolves around that. So what we see here with Ptolemy, it matched what we perceive with our senses, what we see obviously with our physical eyes. It allowed for reasonable astronomical predictions, and it matched, and this is a more important thing, it matched Christian theology with man as the center of the universe, which was very important when it comes to church institution. So we have Samos believe that the earth rotates on its own axis and revolves around the sun with the rest of the planets. And this was an idea conceived 1700 years before Copernicus even came up with his ideas. Copernicus was the one who proposed more officially the heliocentric universe, where the earth and other planets revolve around the sun. And of course, this was a clear challenge to church dogma, which amounted to committing heresy. And this opened many questions regarding church dogma. So if this was indeed true, and there was evidence supported that Copernicus had come up with, then what other stuff does this open up about the church that we need to begin to start to question as we start to examine more closely this notion of Renaissance science. Then we have Bruno, Hermetism, the idea of these magical forces believed to be used to benefit humans. There are these innumerable number of inhabited worlds was Bruno's idea, in these solar systems in which the sun is divine. So he proposed some ideas about aliens and about these other inhabited worlds. And of course, this would go against the ideas established as the official church dogma and doctrine. So Bruno would accept Copernicus' theory because it restored the divine status given to the sun by the ancients. So he has his own mystical ideas, but along with these mystical ideas of other levels of creativity and imagination, in a sense, where he could envision other intelligent life outside of the planet. So Bruno was convicted of heresy, and he eventually was burned at the stake. Then we have Kepler. Kepler accepted again the heliocentric position. It explained the universe in a simple mathematical harmony. Remember, we're looking for parsimony. Oftentimes, we're looking at science, something that simply explains something without having to have a lot of suppositions to be made for something to be actually true. So again, it's more simplistic, more parsimonious. So he proved many of the mathematical details of the Copernican system. So Kepler was able to mathematically support what Copernicus had proposed by way of his approach to viewing the world. He also anticipated Newton's concept of gravity. He insisted that all mathematical deductions be verified by empirical observation. Of course, a very scientific idea that we still hold on to today. Then we have one of the great figures, Galileo. He set out to explain the true mathematical reality that existed beyond the world of appearances. So what we see is not necessarily the real stuff, but we can explain it even more deeply by looking at and examining the notion of mathematics. So he set out to correct misconceptions about the world and heavenly bodies. He used scientific observations to exemplify laws, and then followed by using mathematical deduction to describe the law and thus the universe. So he did a lot of wonderful work to try to establish these basic type of principles which are core to the idea of science. So then we look at this idea of objective and subjective reality. So objective reality exists independent of an individual's perception. Okay, it is what it is, despite the individuals who are observing it. It's not dependent on observation. Now, this includes what later would be called primary qualities, such as quantity of something, the shape of something, the size, position, and the motion of objects. And we'll talk more about this again as well. And then there's also subjective reality, the psychological experiences. These are the things which are going to be based more on the individual who is doing the observing. Okay, for example, if two people are observing the same item and one happens to be colorblind, they will have a different reality than the person who is not colorblind. Okay, it's going to be subjective to them. So subjective reality is going to be based on these psychological experiences requiring a sensing organ. Later, these would be called secondary qualities. These are relative, subjective, and fluctuating, including things like color, sound, temperature, and taste, and things of that nature. So we look at science, and these were some of the questions coming up during this time frame about what is science, how do we answer these questions, how do we go about doing that, and exactly here, what is real, which is a key question in science when we have it. So consciousness can never be studied by objective methods, was one idea that we touched on earlier by some of the great minds and great thinkers earlier. Conscious experience is made up of secondary qualities, which cannot be described or understood mathematically. So the major philosophical shift which made humans inferior to the real world outside of human experience. It excluded from science much of what is now included in psychology because of the subjective nature that these things that we were talking about are observer dependent. It depends on who's doing the observing. And usually when we are working with science, we don't want it to be dependent upon something like that. We want something to be there simply because it is there, not because this person happens to observe it and they have certain psychological makeup or a certain sensory system that makes them see something differently than somebody else would. Then we look at Isaac Newton. He conceived of the universe as a complex, lawful machine created by God, who then set it in motion, after which he ceased involvement, or deism. The idea here is that the Almighty God created the world, put the system in place, and then drops the mic and walks away and let it run by itself. So that was the basic idea that Newton sort of suggested here. The most important contribution was his universal law of gravitation, which, of course, we're all somewhat familiar with. So the principles of Newtonian science, God created the universe but does not actively intervene in the world. The material world is governed by laws which have no exceptions. So things have this system in place that dictates how things are going to get done. There's no place for purpose in natural law. Okay. Occam's razor should be accepted. So this idea of parsimony, the idea of the simplest explanation. Natural laws are absolute, but scientists may have to settle for probabilities rather than certainty, meaning that there are going to be certain times where we cannot know something for certain, but we can have a probability of how certain we may be about something in existence. And also understanding the idea that classification, when we classify something, we categorize something, it does not necessarily say that we can explain it, but we do go through the steps of classifying it, which is also an important aspect of it as well. So these are some of the key ideas that were very important to the ideas of Renaissance science during this time frame. Now, a couple of really key things I want to make sure we understand as well when it comes to a variety of ways that we think. We hear sometimes about deductive versus inductive. Deductive is normally where we start off with a theory, we develop the hypothesis, we do some sort of observation, and then we can either confirm or disconfirm or fail to confirm the observations that support the hypothesis that support the theory. Then another way is inductive, where we can sort of start with the observations, discern the patterns, come up with a tentative hypothesis, and then use that to sort of establish what the theory is. And so we look at these two different approaches about how science can get done. So let's revisit now the idea of Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon really demanded that science be based on induction rather than deduction. He argued that science should only include facts of observations. He maintained that science should not include theories, hypotheses, mathematics, or deductive methods. Bacon's radical empiricism was later called positivism. Now, one of the key things and ideas about Bacon, however, is that he was really radical. And the notion was that he wanted you simply to observe stuff, and from the observation, you could come up with theories or how something is related to one another. But he also believed this idea that you should try to avoid having preconceived notions about things. And we talked about this once before, the idea that you can't have an observation that is theory neutral. Okay, or not theory latent already, that we have biases by our very existence. And so that's where we had our conversation before about theory. There are no neutral observations, and every observation is theory latent. So some of this came up when it comes to trying to deal with the ideas of Bacon. So Bacon generalizations could be made from many observations with their similarities and differences noted, and could be used to describe classes of events and experiences. So by just observing, Bacon was saying, we can come up with all sorts of things, experiences, events, similarities, these theories to help explain the world. Now, he saw that we had to do this in a non-biased way, that we had to avoid certain types of biases. And there were four sources of error that could hinder scientific investigation. Our personal biases, which he referred to as idols of the cave, human nature biases, idols of the tribe, biases of verbal labels, how we use words to label things, the marketplace, idols of the marketplace, and then idols of the theater, biases from blind allegiance to any viewpoint. Again, like that fanatical acceptance of a particular idea. So the idea here is that Bacon saw all these things as being very problematic, and we had to avoid them in order to make sure that we were doing good science. So Bacon was ahead of his time in insisting that scientists avoid bias. Okay, and we should do that. But there are certain types of things that we cannot avoid. Okay, we need to make sure that we understand that. So the key things that he did promote, the idea here, is that science should provide useful information, okay, and improve the world for the betterment of mankind. Again, that's sort of a Renaissance idea as well. So Skinner and behavior analysis adopted the Baconian inductive method and the view that the main goal of science is to improve the human condition. So the idea here is that with Francis Bacon, he set the stage. He was a hardcore empiricist, okay, that it's all about observing the world, and that's how we get to know the world and gain knowledge by this observation. But he was hardcore in trying to say we need to avoid the bias so that our ideas that we do come up with would be more accurate and not filled with bias. And some of these ideas we do hold on to today, even as part of our scientific endeavor. Then we get to Rene Descartes. And Rene Descartes, he was a rationalist, so he relied a great deal more on the idea of rationality and logic. Okay? So he relied on self-exploration, since nothing in philosophy was beyond doubt. So let me give you a little bit of a explanation here of a few things. So Rene Descartes, let's say, for example, he would start off with the idea that, we can observe things, we can use our senses to learn about the world. But at one point, he came to understand that we cannot know about the world accurately because our senses sometimes mislead us, lie to us, we misperceive things. And so he realized that the only way to really know something for certain is to use rationality, to use logic and rationale to try to understand what the truth is. And so he eventually had to take all the things that he believed and put them to the side and say, I believe nothing, until he can believe in something without having doubt associated to it in some manner. And this is where his I think, therefore I am became very important. So once he sort of removed all the stuff that he believed at one point, but then had doubt in some way, he removed all that type of stuff. He says, okay, what is the one thing that I know for certain that I can believe in without doubt? And he came up with, I think, therefore I am. That he was a thinking, doubting entity. Therefore, he must be a doubting, thinking entity having that particular thought. Therefore, I think, therefore I am. He explained into existence that he was at least a doubting entity that did exist. So that was the key idea that phrase leads to, and he was able to build back his whole belief system to a certain extent based on that one idea. So through analysis of his own thoughts, he determined that some ideas are innate, natural components of the mind. We saw this idea about nativism before, or innate ideas, that they're already in us. We just have to rediscover them. So these innate ideas were things like unity, infinity, perfection, axioms of geometry, and God. So the idea these things already exist within us. It's just a matter of us trying to rediscover them in a sense. So his method was a combination of intuition and deduction. He restored dignity to a purely subjective experience. In addition to the validity of rational processes, knowledge gained through the senses could be accepted because God, being perfect, would not and could not deceive us. Sensory information had to be analyzed rationally to determine its validity. So, yes, you could use your sensory systems to observe something in the world, but then you would have to use your rational systems, okay, your rationality, your logic to analyze and to validate that information. So, as I said, he was a rationalist, a nativist, the idea of innate ideas, and a phenomenologist, where he basically said introspectively study the nature of intact conscious experiences is what he was attempting to do. He explained the behavior of animals, including humans, employing mechanical principles. So the idea here, he says to some extent that everything that is in existence is running on the same principles, these mechanistic types of principles, just that some of them are much more complex than others. So it's going to be a different in a matter degree of complexity. So he sort of like mechanized the universe. He looked at things like the reflex. He believed the neuron systems or the nervous system was a set of hollow tubes connecting the sense receptors with cavities in the brain or the ventricles. So he tried to come up with ideas to explain. He wasn't always on target, but he did get some general gist of the ideas about how things were operating in the body. So one of the key things I want to emphasize here is that he mechanized the universe to a degree, saying we are all basically mechanisms. And so one animal may be one type of mechanism, the human may be another type of mechanism, but we're all still mechanisms. So some of the basic principles that may explain the mechanism of a lower animal can also be used to help explain some of those basic principles, mechanical principles that we have as well. So again, we can see him saying, yeah, we can use these lower animals to help explain us higher animals to some extent. So he also looked at the brain contain animal spirits which flow through the nerves, resulting in sensation and movement. Again, not necessarily on target, but in a ballpark, trying to explain how these things are working together in sort of mechanistic process. And by explaining both animal and human behavior in terms of these mechanistic principles and reflexes, he did legitimize the study of animals. And unlike animals, only humans have mind. He was clear to make that difference known, that animals may have these mechanistic principles, but they do not possess minds. Only humans have minds. He sort of equated the idea of mind with that of soul. And a lot of these discussions, by the way, about mind, body, soul, had to deal with the fact they wanted to have questions answered about what happens if your body is destroyed and is no longer around there, and the rapture happens, and people are being taken up to heaven. Are they out of luck? And I did know the soul, the mind is indestructible. It's always there, and so available to be taken up. So the mind provided consciousness, free will, and rationality. However, the mind was non-physical and the body was physical. The body can be destroyed, but the mind cannot. So the non-physical mind and the physical body can influence each other, thus regarding the mind-body issue that we discussed previously. He was a dualist. He was believing in the idea of the mind and body being separate and independent, but do interact with each other. He determined that the mind influenced the body at the pineal gland in the brain. That was his belief. So among Descartes' contributions to psychology are the mechanistic explanations of behavior and many bodily functions. It could be said to have led to the stimulus response explanations and to behaviorism as well. So the focus on the brain as an important mediator of behavior was key. So here he's saying this brain, this physical thing in our skull, does have something to do with our behavior. It mediates in some way. So the description of the mind-body relationship provided others the opportunity to support or to refute it. One of the key things that we saw back in these days, when a philosopher would come up with an idea, the others would then agree with or disagree with it, and then do what, say why and why not, and then the other philosophers and scientists would do the same type of idea. So sort of this back and forth, this major ongoing continual debate. So the idea here, he studied the bodies of animals as a means to understand the functioning of human bodies. So he looked at animals to look at human bodies, to understand them better. And of course, this led to physiological and comparative psychology as well. So he paved the way for the scientific study of consciousness on many levels. Real briefly, I want to go over historical eras real quickly. We've talked about a few of them already. I just want to just give us a little bit of a real quick overview of some of the ideas here real quickly, put it in context. So we've looked at a couple of major eras already. We've talked about the ancient history, which would include, to some extent, the area of the ancient Greeks. We talked about the Middle Ages, which include the Dark Ages. And now we've talked about the Renaissance. So those are the key main areas. We'll see a couple of other ones later. We'll talk a little bit more about Enlightenment at one point. But these are the eras that sort of describe what was going on at those times. Here's a picture of the timeline that we see here with ancient history. We can see the birth of Jesus Christ there. We can see the BC or BCE, before Christian or Common Era, AD or CE, with the meaning behind that. And we can see what we just talked about earlier, the end of the Roman Empire, which sort of heralds in the idea of the Middle Ages that we've talked about before. So we see that sort of goes back to some of the areas that we've talked about. And then we talk real quickly about the idea of the Greeks and the Romans. When the Romans invade Greek territory, there were some things which were decidedly Greek, some things which were decidedly Roman, and those things were sort of a combination of two. I want to just give you a little bit of a background so you can understand some of the characteristics in the artwork that you may have seen as well. For example, if you look at artwork, it's going to have more of a Greek influence. If you look at things which are full body figures, are depicted and dominate. Figures are idealized and follow a certain type of rule structure. They appear to be very youthful and athletic male figures. Some figurative sculptures are used for funerary purposes. They do not portray the deceased, but the ideal figure. So here, we see there was this idealism that we saw with the Greeks of the ideal male or female figure, and many of these figures are depicted nude. Let's go to the right side here and look at the Romans. The Romans' portraits and figures are depicted, portraits that dominate. The figures and portraits are more naturalistic, specific to the individual, so they're not idealized. They look a little bit more like the person that they may use as that model. Portraits express the individual's character, stressing their age and experience. So we don't see these idealized figures anymore. We see also portrait figures and architect dominate and serve as instruments of propaganda. So they're communicating certain ideas and beliefs that they have. We see that with the Romans. And familiar portraits of the deceased are common to show someone's status. So someone's important. We'll see those important figures in portraits as well as in sculptures as well. And then we have sort of a combination of both of them when it comes to this artwork. The Greco-Roman artwork portrays imagery from the region's historical and mythical events are going to be more likely to be demonstrated there, so a lot more myth shown. Sculptures utilize bronze and marble more. Figures are posed in a certain way to sort of describe a certain type of situation. I guess I want to clarify the idea of the Catrapasto, where the idea here is sort of like a painting of damned souls in Dante's Inferno, so that was a common thing that we saw there as well. So the idea here is that there were characteristics in artwork that sort of identified it as being either Greek, Roman, or Greco-Roman. And so those are some of the ideas that we saw influenced as well. So in looking at that further, I just want to remind ourselves some of the characteristics that we saw at the Dark Ages that followed that period. Early Middle Ages, 5th to 11th century AD, around that time frame, a time of intellectual and cultural darkness permeating Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. I want to emphasize here again, we're talking about Europe. So Europe is where we saw this darkness reign. In other parts of the world, this was not going on. So there are a few historical or written records at this time frame. That's why they refer to it oftentimes as the Dark Ages. Not that it was just not light out there, but there wasn't a lot of records written like they were in previous time frames. And again, we saw a great deal of plague, war, and stagnant culture, but we did see the rise of Christianity, and then the Crusades aimed to present the spread of Islam. So the Crusades itself, which led ultimately to the rediscovery of some of the old ancient Greek works, was done as sort of a competition move to try to prevent the spread of another religion from taking root, and that is Islam. So the idea here is when it comes to characteristics, as we stated earlier, the Renaissance was a very paradoxical time. Great human achievements, interest in human potential, unparalleled creativity, but also some really bad stuff going on as well. So we see that these are things that were very problematic and very diverse during this particular time frame that caused some issues. Now let's wrap this up real quickly, but I just want to go real quickly to show you some other images here. During the time of the Renaissance, we had this ideology, one steeped in supernatural politics, alchemy, angelology, demonology, the divine right of kings, all this type of stuff, battles over the right of succession and some of the monarchies and royal houses. We saw again with Martin Luther separating from the church. We saw Henry VIII wanting this to be done so that he could marry someone else, divorce someone and marry someone else. So there are a lot of personal reasons and things not having to do really with any religion necessarily, but what men wanted to do and new ways of viewing how religion should be done that did cause some splits in the church. Factionalism, religious wars lasted for long periods of time, as we saw the Catholic nations and the Protestant nations lined up against each other and began fighting off and on for various reasons and rationales based on religion. And of course, we have the heresy and inquisitions that were going on as well, where anything that was thought to be against the beliefs of the church went at variance with the common beliefs of the church. The institution of the Inquisitions would charge these individuals with heresy and put them on trial and things of that nature. And of course, there are many punishments out there. The idea of people being burnt for disagreeing with the church or behaving poorly or in some sort of ordained way, you could be punished severely and be put to death, which was very problematic, obviously. And of course, this had great impacts on the scientific world. Galileo being arrested for permanent house arrest, Copernicus waiting until he was near his deathbed before he released his material, Bruno actually being burned at the stake, and Severus, who made important contributions to medicine and anatomy, he was pronounced a heretic because he denied the Trinity. He too also was burned at the stake. So we see these individuals and all this type of stuff happening during this time of the Renaissance, which we see here. So a little bit later, we'll see the scientific revolution has already sort of started during the time of the Renaissance, and then we'll get to the Enlightenment and then Romanticism a little bit later to sort of describe some of the influence of these particular historical eras. So that is really what I want to cover today. We've covered most of this stuff already. I just want to make sure that I showed you these particular slides and graphs, and that is it for now, and I will talk to you guys later.